December 1891, Montana Territory. When Harriet Brennan's third husband was found dead in his study with no visible wounds, the townspeople of Silver Ridge didn't call for the sheriff, they called for the priest. Whispers of a curse had followed her since she was 19, and now, at 32, 3 wedding rings sat in her jewelry box alongside 3 death certificates. No man in Silver Ridge would even look in her direction anymore. Crossing the street when she walked to the general store, mothers pulling their sons away as if death itself clung to her skirts. But when a drifting ranch hand named Cole Madsen rode into town that winter, he did something no one expected. He tipped his hat to the Black Widow of Silver Ridge and asked her to dance. Was Harriet Brennan truly cursed to kill every man who loved her? Or was something far more sinister hiding in the shadows of Silver Ridge? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time Harriet Brennan buried her husband, she was 19 years old and still believed in fairy tales. Thomas Whitmore had been the son of Silver Ridge's wealthiest cattle baron, a young man with sandy hair and dreams bigger than the Montana sky. Their courtship had been the talk of the territory. Picnics by Copper Creek, evening rides through the meadows, stolen kisses behind the church after Sunday service. When he proposed on her 19th birthday with his grandmother's sapphire ring, Harriet thought she'd found her forever. They were married in June of 1878, with half the territory in attendance. The ceremony took place under a canopy of wildflowers at the Whitmore estate, and Harriet wore a dress of ivory silk that had been shipped all the way from San Francisco. Thomas's father spared no expense, hiring a quartet from Helena and serving champagne that cost more per bottle than most families earned in a month. Harriet remembered dancing until her feet ached, Thomas spinning her across the lawn while fireflies danced in the dusk. She remembered his father's speech, welcoming her into the family with tears in his eyes. She remembered feeling like the luckiest woman alive. 3 weeks later, Thomas was dead. He'd gone out to check on the southern fence line, something he'd done 100 times before. His horse returned at sunset without him, reins dragging in the dust. They found Thomas face down in Hollow Creek, his body wedged between 2 rocks in water that barely reached his knees. The doctor ruled it an accident, said Thomas must have been thrown, hit his head on a rock, and drowned in the shallow water before he could regain consciousness. There was a gash on his temple, blood in his sandy hair, and his neck bent at an angle that made Harriet's stomach turn. She screamed when they brought him home, screamed until her voice gave out, until Thomas's mother had to hold her down while the doctor administered laudanum. The funeral was held on a Tuesday, and Harriet stood at the graveside in black crepe, 20 years old and already a widow. She remembered the way people looked at her, with pity, yes, but something else too. Something she couldn't quite name at the time. The Whitmore family was kind to her in the aftermath. Thomas's father let her stay in the guest house on the property, gave her a monthly allowance, treated her like the daughter he'd never had. Harriet spent a year in mourning, wearing black, attending church, trying to make sense of a world that had stolen her future so suddenly. She visited Thomas's grave every Sunday, placing fresh flowers on the headstone and talking to him like he could still hear her. Eventually, slowly, life began to move forward. She was 21 when she met Daniel Forrester at a harvest dance. Daniel was different from Thomas, quieter, more serious, a banker's son with spectacles and careful hands. He'd courted her slowly, respectfully, never pushing too hard or moving too fast. He brought her books of poetry, walked with her along Main Street, asked permission before taking her hand. When he proposed after 8 months of courtship, Harriet said yes, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she could find happiness again. Their wedding in April of 1880 was smaller, more subdued. Harriet wore grey instead of white. It seemed more appropriate for a second wedding, more respectful to Thomas's memory. Daniel's parents hosted the reception at their home in town, and though there was cake and music, the celebration felt muted somehow, like everyone was holding their breath. Harriet noticed the way some guests whispered behind their hands, the way Daniel's aunt watched her with narrowed eyes. But she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on Daniel's gentle smile and the promise of a fresh start. They moved into a modest house on Elm Street, with a garden in back and a front porch that caught the morning sun. Daniel worked at his father's bank, coming home each evening at 6 o'clock sharp. Harriet kept house, planted roses, joined the ladies' auxiliary at church. For 5 months life was peaceful, predictable, almost boring in the best possible way. She began to think that maybe the tragedy with Thomas had been just that. A tragedy, a terrible accident. Nothing more. Then came September. Daniel had complained of chest pains that morning, dismissing them as indigestion from the previous night's dinner. He'd gone to work anyway, kissing Harriet's cheek at the door like he always did. At 2 in the afternoon, Daniel's clerk came running to the house, his face pale and his words tumbling out in a rush. Daniel had collapsed at his desk, clutching his chest and gasping for air. By the time the doctor arrived, Daniel Forrester was dead, at 27 years old. Heart failure, the doctor said. Sometimes it happened in young men, a weakness in the heart muscle, undetectable until it was too late. Daniel's father demanded a second opinion and brought in a specialist from Butte. The specialist examined Daniel's body, reviewed his medical history, and came to the same conclusion. A tragic but natural death. Nothing to be done. These things happened, but the whispers started then, low and insistent as wind through grass. 2 husbands, both dead within 2 years of marriage. What were the odds? At Daniel's funeral, Harriet felt the stares like brands against her skin. She saw the way people stepped back when she approached, the way mothers pulled their daughters close when she passed. She heard fragments of conversations that died the moment. She drew near, both so young. Can't be. Coincidence? Something. Wrong with that girl. Thomas's father stopped, sending the monthly allowance. Daniel's parents asked her to vacate the house on Elm Street within the month. The ladies' auxiliary at church suddenly had no openings for new projects. Invitations to social gatherings dried up like rain in August. At 23 years old, Harriet Brennan found herself alone in a town that had started to fear her. She took a position as a seamstress, renting a small room above the general store and taking in mending work to survive. For 3 years, she kept her head down and her mouth shut, speaking only when spoken to, avoiding eye contact on the street. She told herself she didn't need anyone, didn't want anyone. She'd loved twice and lost twice, and maybe that was enough for one lifetime. Maybe she was meant to be alone. Then she met Jonathan Hayes. Jonathan was a surveyor from the back east, hired by the territorial government to map the lands around Silver Ridge. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a laugh that could fill a room. He stayed at the boarding house where Harriet sometimes delivered mending, and they struck up a conversation one afternoon when he asked her to repair a torn jacket. He knew nothing of her history and saw her simply as a pretty woman with sad eyes and capable hands. Harriet resisted at first, warned him away, told him she wasn't the type of woman a man should get involved with. But Jonathan was persistent, charming, utterly convinced that whatever shadows haunted her could be faced together. He courted her openly, defiantly, walking with her down Main Street while the town watched in horror. He proposed after 6 months, and when Harriet tried to refuse, he'd taken her hands and said something she'd never forgotten. "I don't believe in curses, Harriet Brennan. I believe in you." They married in November of 1883, a private ceremony with just the justice of the peace and 2 witnesses pulled in from the street. Jonathan moved into Harriet's room above the general store, and for a while, 7 beautiful, precious months, Harriet allowed herself to believe that maybe the curse had been lifted. Maybe 3 times was the charm. Maybe Jonathan's love was strong enough to break whatever darkness followed her. Jonathan died on a Tuesday in June. Found slumped over his desk in the surveying office, with ink still wet on the map he'd been drawing. No marks, no signs of violence, no explanation. The doctor examined him, checked his heart and lungs, and looked for any indication of what had killed a healthy 30-year-old man. There was nothing. No poison in his system, no disease in his organs, no reason at all why Jonathan Hayes should have simply stopped breathing in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Sometimes, the doctor had said, avoiding Harriet's eyes, people just die. But this time, the town didn't accept the explanation. This time, when Harriet walked through Silver Ridge in her black morning dress, people didn't just whisper, they spoke aloud. "Black Widow," they called her. "Death's bride." Mothers snatched their children off the street when she approached. Men turned their backs when she passed. The owner of the general store asked her to find new lodgings. Unable to meet her eyes as he explained that her presence was bad for business, Harriet moved to a small cabin on the edge of town, a dilapidated structure that no one else wanted. She stopped going to church, stopped going anywhere she didn't absolutely have to. She ordered supplies through a delivery boy who left them on her porch and collected payment without ever looking at her face. For 8 years, from 1884 to 1891, Harriet Brennan lived like a ghost, existing but not living, surviving but not thriving. She was 32 years old, and she'd given up on everything except waking up each morning and making it through another day. The cabin she occupied sat at the far western edge of Silver Ridge, where the grasslands began their roll toward the mountains. It was a one-room structure with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs she'd never need, and windows that rattled in the wind. The roof leaked when it rained, and the door didn't hang quite right, and in winter the cold seeped through every crack in the walls. But it was hers, paid for with money she earned taking in sewing work from the few people willing to do business with her through intermediaries. She developed a routine over those 8 years, a pattern that kept her sane. Rise at dawn, brew coffee, eat whatever simple breakfast she could manage. Spend the morning sewing, mending shirts, hemming dresses, doing the invisible work that kept her fed. In the afternoon, she'd walk the perimeter of her property, tending the small vegetable garden she'd coaxed from the stubborn soil. The evening was for reading. She'd built a small collection of books, purchased from a traveling merchant who didn't know her story and didn't care. She rarely saw other people. The delivery boy occasionally, the merchant who came through once a month with supplies, a few brave souls who needed sewing work done and were willing to overlook superstition for the sake of her skill with a needle. That was her life, and she'd made her peace with it, until December of 1891. When Cole Madsen rode into Silver Ridge, Harriet first heard about him from the delivery boy, a 16-year-old named Timothy who was too young to remember the deaths and too talkative to maintain proper, fearful silence. "New fellow in town," Timothy said, setting a crate of supplies on her porch. "Ranch hand, looking for winter work. Got hired on at the McClintock spread yesterday. Says he's from Wyoming, though he doesn't talk much about where exactly." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Harriet nodded absently, counting out coins for the supplies. She didn't care about newcomers to Silver Ridge. They'd learn soon enough to avoid her, but Timothy wasn't finished. "Funny thing, though, Mr. Peterson at the saloon was telling him about you. You know, the usual warnings and whatnot. And this Cole fellow, he just smiled and asked where you lived." Timothy's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and excitement, like he was curious or something. Like he didn't believe the stories. Harriet's hand stilled on the coins. "He asked where I lived?" "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Peterson told him to stay clear of you if he knew what was good for him. But this Cole, he just finished his whiskey and said something about not believing in ghost stories." Timothy leaned in conspiratorially. "You think he'll come out here?" "No," Harriet said firmly, pressing the coins into Timothy's palm. "And if he does, you tell Mr. Peterson that I don't want visitors. Tell everyone that I don't want visitors." But even as she spoke, something flickered in her chest, something she'd thought died with Jonathan Hayes. Curiosity, maybe, or hope, though she barely recognized it anymore. 3 days later, on a cold December afternoon with snow threatening in the grey clouds overhead, Harriet heard hoofbeats approaching her cabin. She was at her sewing table, working on a dress hem by the light from the window, and the sound made her freeze with the needle halfway through fabric. No one came to her cabin, ever. She stood slowly, setting aside the dress and moving to the window. A man on horseback was making his way up the path to her door. A tall figure in a worn leather coat and a dark hat pulled low against the wind. He rode with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his whole life in a saddle, and as he drew closer, Harriet could see he was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30 or so, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He stopped his horse 20 feet from her cabin, staying in the saddle as if aware that approaching the door might frighten her. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Harriet framed her window. The stranger, sitting easy on his horse with one hand resting on his thigh. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was somehow both respectful and familiar, and called out, "Afternoon, ma'am. My name's Cole Madsen. I was wondering if you might have time for a conversation." Harriet's first instinct was to turn away, to ignore him until he left. But something about the way he sat there, patient, calm, not demanding anything, made her open the door. She stood on her threshold, arms crossed against the cold, and said, "I don't receive visitors, Mr. Madsen. So I've heard." His voice was low and steady, with a hint of something that might have been amusement. "I've heard quite a lot about you since I came to Silver Ridge, Mrs. Brennan. Heard you're cursed. Heard you kill any man who gets close to you. Heard you're in league with the devil himself." He paused, then smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "Funny thing is, I don't believe a word of it." "Then you're a fool," Harriet said bluntly. "Maybe so." Cole dismounted with fluid grace, though he made no move to come closer. "Or maybe I'm just someone who's seen enough of the world to know that people make up stories when they're scared or confused. They need someone to blame when bad things happen. And you, Mrs. Brennan, you're convenient." Harriet felt something tighten in her chest. "3 husbands, Mr. Madsen, all dead. You think that's a coincidence?" "I think it's a tragedy," Cole said quietly. "I think you've suffered more than any person should have to suffer. And I think this town has made it worse by turning grief into folklore." He took a step forward, then stopped when Harriet tensed. "I'm not here to court you, Mrs. Brennan. I'm not here to test the curse or prove anything. I'm here because I thought you might like to know that someone in Silver Ridge sees you as a person instead of a ghost story." For the first time in 8 years, tears stung Harriet's eyes. She blinked them back furiously, unwilling to show weakness to this stranger. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," Cole said simply, "except maybe permission to say hello when I ride past. Maybe eventually you'll say hello back." He touched his hat again, mounted his horse, and rode away before Harriet could formulate a response. She stood on her threshold long after he'd disappeared from view, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. Feeling something she'd thought was dead and buried along with Thomas and Daniel and Jonathan, she felt alive. Cole. Madsen kept his word in a way that surprised Harriet more than anything else in the 8 years since Jonathan's death. Every few days, he'd ride past her cabin on his way to or from the McClintock Ranch, and each time he'd tip his hat and call out a simple greeting. "Morning, Mrs. Brennan." "Afternoon. Cold one today, isn't it?" At first, Harriet didn't respond. She'd watch from her window as he passed, her sewing forgotten in her hands, trying to understand what game he was playing. No one in Silver Ridge acknowledged her existence unless absolutely necessary, and certainly no one went out of their way to greet her like she was just another neighbor. It had to be some kind of trick, some elaborate setup for mockery or worse, but Cole never asked for anything, never slowed his horse to linger, never tried to approach her cabin or engage her in longer conversation. He simply offered his greeting and moved on, as casual as if they were old friends instead of strangers in a town that believed she carried death in her shadow. 2 weeks after their first encounter, Harriet found herself standing on her porch when she heard his horse approaching. When Cole came into view and touched his hat, she lifted her hand in a brief wave. The smile that broke across his face was worth the risk of hoping. "Progress," he called out cheerfully. And Harriet felt the corner of her mouth twitch, not quite a smile, but close enough that it startled her. By January, their exchanges had evolved into actual conversations, though brief ones. Cole would stop his horse near her fence, and they'd talk about simple things. The weather, the health of her vegetable garden buried under snow, the quality of the elk herd in the mountains. He never asked about her past, never mentioned the curse or the deaths or anything that might make her retreat back into her shell. He treated her like she was normal, and Harriet had forgotten how desperately she'd craved normal. She learned things about him in fragments. He was 31, born in Texas but raised in Wyoming after his mother died when he was 7. He'd worked ranches across the West, never staying in one place too long, always moving when the seasons changed. He had a sister in Denver who wrote him letters he never answered, and a father buried somewhere in Wyoming whose grave he hadn't visited in 10 years. He could read and write better than most ranch hands, having been taught by a school teacher in Cheyenne who'd taken pity on a motherless boy. "Why Silver Ridge?" Harriet asked one afternoon in late January, her breath making clouds in the frozen air. "There are ranches all over Montana. Why stop here?" Cole shrugged, though something in his eyes suggested the question wasn't as simple as it seemed. "Heard the McClintock spread was hiring. I needed work for the winter. Sometimes the reason is just that straightforward. And the other times?" "Other times," Cole said slowly, "a man gets tired of running and decides to see what happens if he stands still for a while." He looked at her directly then, and Harriet felt the weight of that gaze. "What about you, Mrs. Brennan? Have you ever thought about leaving Silver Ridge?" "Every day," Harriet admitted, the honesty surprising her. "But where would I go? This is all I know. And at least here, people leave me alone." "Alone isn't the same as at peace," Cole observed. "You deserve better than this cabin at the edge of nowhere, talking to a drifter through a fence." "Maybe this is exactly what I deserve," Harriet said quietly. Cole was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those steady eyes. Then he said something that would echo in Harriet's mind for days afterward. "I don't believe the universe is in the business of punishing people for loving too much. If it was, we'd all be cursed." He rode away before she could respond, leaving Harriet standing in the cold with tears freezing on her cheeks. The turning point came in February, during a blizzard that swept down from the mountains and buried Silver Ridge under 3 feet of snow. Harriet woke to find her firewood supply dangerously low and her small store of food reduced to dried beans and a bit of salted meat. The delivery boy wouldn't be able to reach her cabin for days, maybe weeks if the storm kept up. She rationed what she had and tried not to think about the cold seeping through the walls or the hunger gnawing at her belly. On the 3rd day of the storm, she heard something outside, not hoofbeats but the crunch of boots through deep snow. Harriet moved to the window and saw Cole Madsen making his way toward her cabin, leading his horse through drifts that reached the animal's chest. He had saddlebags slung over his shoulder and a bundle of firewood strapped to his back. Harriet threw open the door, fear and anger warring in her chest. "What are you doing?" "You'll freeze to death out there. Figured you might need supplies," Cole said calmly, as if he hadn't just walked miles through a blizzard that had shut down the entire town. "McClintock gave me permission to bring you firewood and food. Said he'd advance it against my wages." "You paid for this?" Harriet stared at him, snow swirling around them both. "Why would you do that?" "Because you need it," Cole said simply. He moved past her into the cabin, stamping snow from his boots, and began unloading the saddlebags onto her table. Flour, coffee, bacon, dried apples, a small sack of sugar. Luxuries Harriet hadn't tasted in months. "And because I'm not about to let you starve or freeze on account of this town's superstition." Harriet watched him stack firewood by the fireplace, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. "They'll talk," she said finally. "You come out here like this. They'll say you're the next one. They'll say the curse will take you." Cole straightened, brushing bark from his gloves, and looked at her with something like amusement. "Mrs. Brennan, they've been saying that since the first time I tipped my hat to you. I'm still here. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Cole interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. I understand that you're scared. I understand that you've lost people you loved, and this town has convinced you that it's somehow your fault. I understand that you've been alone for so long that kindness looks like a trap. He took a step toward her, slow enough that she could retreat if she wanted. But here's what else I understand. I like you, Harriet Brennan. I like your stubbornness and your sadness, and the way you're still standing when a weaker person would have broken. And I'm not going anywhere just because some ignorant fools think you're cursed. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice did something to Harriet's carefully constructed walls. She found herself crying, really crying, not the silent tears she'd shed alone in the dark, but great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. Cole caught her before she could collapse, his arms solid and warm, and he held her while she cried out 8 years of grief and loneliness and fear. When the storm finally broke, she made him coffee, and they sat at her table talking until the sun set and rose again. She told him about Thomas's laugh, Daniel's gentle hands, Jonathan's unwavering faith in her. She told him about the funerals and the whispers and the slow starvation of being cut off from human connection. She told him things she'd never told anyone, secrets she'd kept locked away because there was no one left who cared to listen. Cole listened to all of it without judgment, without fear, without flinching at the parts that made her voice break. And when she finally ran out of words, he told her his own story, about the father who drunk himself to death after his mother died, about the years of wandering and searching for something he couldn't name, about the loneliness of never belonging anywhere or to anyone. We're a pair, aren't we? Harriet said with a weak laugh as dawn light filtered through her window. The cursed widow and the drifter who can't stay in one place. Maybe, Cole said thoughtfully. Or maybe we're just two people who've been alone too long, finding each other at exactly the right time. After that night, Cole became a regular presence at Harriet's cabin. He'd stop by after finishing work at the McClintock Ranch, sometimes bringing supplies, sometimes just his company. They'd sit on her porch when the weather allowed, or by her fireplace when it didn't, talking about everything and nothing. He taught her to play cards, and she taught him to appreciate the novels she'd collected over the years. He fixed the leaks in her roof and the broken hinge on her door, and she mended his shirts and cooked meals that reminded him what it felt like to have a home. The town noticed, of course. Timothy, the delivery boy, reported that the saloon was buzzing with speculation about Cole Madsen and the Black Widow. Bets were being placed on how long before Cole turned up dead, with odds improving in the house's favor with each passing week. The minister gave a sermon about the dangers of consorting with evil, though he didn't mention Harriet by name. Women clutched their prayer books and predicted doom. Cole found it hilarious. "They've got me dying 5 different ways," he told Harriet one evening, grinning as he dealt cards. Poison, heart failure, mysterious accident, drowning, and my personal favorite, spontaneous combustion. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house said she's already planning my funeral. "It's not funny," Harriet said, though she couldn't quite suppress her own smile. "Cole, I don't want you to become number 4. I couldn't bear it." His expression sobered at that, and he reached across the table to take her hand, a gesture that had become comfortable between them over the past weeks. "Harriet, I need you to hear something. I don't believe in your curse. I don't believe in curses at all. I believe in bad luck and worse timing. And I believe this town has been cruel to you because it's easier than admitting that sometimes terrible things just happen. But 3 times, it's still just a coincidence," Cole said firmly. "Tragic, heartbreaking coincidence, but coincidence nonetheless. And even if it wasn't, even if there was some dark force following you around, I'd still be here. Because whatever time I get with you is worth the risk." Harriet's eyes filled with tears. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the most foolish. Can't I be both?" Cole's smile was soft and genuine. "Harriet, I know you're scared, but you can't live your whole life afraid to let people in. That's not living at all. That's just waiting to die. What if something happens to you? What if— Then at least I'll have spent these months with you, Cole interrupted. At least I'll have known what it feels like to care about someone and have them care back. That's more than a lot of people ever get. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm not asking you to marry me or make any promises. I'm just asking you to stop pushing me away because you're afraid of what might happen. Live in the now, Harriet. That's all any of us can do. Harriet wanted to argue, wanted to list all the reasons why letting him closer was dangerous, why she should send him away for his own good. But the truth was she didn't want to. For the first time in 8 years, she felt like a person instead of a ghost story. For the first time since Jonathan died, she had something to look forward to when she woke up in the morning. All right, she whispered. All right. By March, when the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared in the valley, Harriet and Cole had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost domestic. He'd arrive at her cabin after work, often bringing a rabbit or quail he'd hunted, and she'd cook dinner while he did repairs or read aloud from whatever book she'd selected. They'd eat together, talk for hours, and sometimes, though not often, enough for either of them, he'd pull her into his arms and kiss her with a tenderness that made her believe in the possibility of happy endings. The town watched and waited for disaster. But March passed without incident, and April came with wildflowers blooming across the meadow behind Harriet's cabin. Cole brought her seeds for her garden, and they spent a Sunday afternoon planting tomatoes and squash and beans, their hands covered in dirt and their laughter carried away on the spring wind. You know what I think, Cole said as they worked, his shoulder brushing against hers. I think this cabin needs more than just a vegetable garden. I think it needs chickens, maybe a goat for milk, maybe even a few horses if we expanded the fence line. Harriet paused in her planting, looking at him carefully. That sounds like you're planning to stay a while. I am, Cole said simply. If you'll have me. Not in your cabin. I'm not presumptuous enough to suggest that, and I respect your reputation too much to compromise it. But I could build a small place on the other side of the property, close enough to help with the heavy work, far enough to keep the gossips from having ammunition. He met her eyes steadily. I'm tired of drifting, Harriet. I'm tired of being alone. And I think maybe you are too. Harriet's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Cole, if something happens to you, nothing's going to happen to me, Cole said with absolute certainty. I'm going to live to be an old man, cranky and gray, sitting on a porch with you and arguing about whose turn it is to feed the chickens. That's the future I see, Harriet. The only curse around here is the one you've put on yourself by believing you don't deserve happiness. What if you're wrong? Then I'm wrong, Cole said, reaching up to cup her face with his dirt-stained hand. But I don't think I am. And more importantly, I think it's time you stopped letting fear make your decisions for you. Harriet closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the solid presence of this impossible man beside her. For 8 years, she'd been barely surviving. For 8 years, she'd accepted that her story was over, that she'd used up all her chances at love and life. But maybe, just maybe, Cole Matson was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding and start living. All right, she said, opening her eyes and looking at him with a mixture of terror and hope. Build your cabin, stay, let's see what happens. The smile that broke across Cole's face was brighter than the spring sun. And when he kissed her there in the garden, with dirt under their nails and seeds waiting to be planted, Harriet felt something shift inside her. Not the death of fear, that would take longer to overcome, but the birth of possibility. For the first time since she was 19 years old, Harriet Brennan allowed herself to believe in a future. Cole broke ground on his cabin in May, on a flat stretch of land about 50 yards from Harriet's dwelling. He'd saved enough from his wages at the McClintock Ranch to buy lumber from the mill in town. Though the transaction had been awkward, the mill owner's wife had crossed herself when she realized who the wood was for and muttered prayers under her breath while her husband counted out the boards. Let them pray, Cole had said when he told Harriet about it that evening. Maybe they'll pray so hard they'll forget to gossip. But gossip was the lifeblood of Silver Ridge, and the news that Cole Madsen was building a permanent structure on the Black Widow's property spread through town faster than fire through dry grass. The betting pool at the saloon reached new heights, with some men wagering Cole would be dead before he finished framing the walls. Others bet he'd come to his senses and leave town before summer's end. No one, not a single soul, bet that he'd live to see the cabin completed. Harriet tried not to let the whispers bother her, but they crept into her thoughts during the quiet moments. She'd watch Cole work, his shirt off in the May heat as he hauled timbers and drove nails, and she'd feel the familiar cold dread settling in her stomach. He was so alive, so vital, so determined to build a future that included her. What if the town was right? What if whatever darkness had claimed Thomas and Daniel and Jonathan was simply waiting for the right moment to take Cole too? She kept these fears to herself, though. Cole had asked her to live in the present, to stop letting terror dictate her choices, and she was trying. When the fear got too loud, she'd force herself into the garden or throw herself into sewing work, keeping her hands busy so her mind couldn't spiral into dark places. The cabin took shape slowly over the following weeks. Cole worked on it during his days off from the ranch, and sometimes Harriet would bring him lunch and stay to help, holding boards steady while he hammered, fetching nails when he ran short, handing him tools when he called for them. They worked well together, falling into an easy rhythm that felt like they'd been building things side by side for years instead of weeks. "You're good at this," Cole observed one afternoon as Harriet helped him fit a window frame into place. "You sure you never built anything before?" "My father was a carpenter back in Ohio," Harriet said, surprising herself with the memory. She rarely thought about her childhood anymore, about the life she'd lived before coming to Montana Territory as a 17-year-old bride. "I used to help him in his workshop when I was young. My mother hated it, said it wasn't proper for a girl, but Papa let me anyway. Smart man, your father." Cole secured the frame with careful taps of his hammer. "What brought your family out west?" "They didn't come," Harriet said quietly. "I came alone to marry Thomas. We corresponded through a mutual friend, and when he proposed by letter, I said yes. I thought it was romantic, traveling across the country to marry a man I'd only seen in photographs." She laughed bitterly. "I was so young." "So stupid." Cole set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. "You weren't stupid. You were brave. And romantic doesn't have to mean foolish. Sometimes it just means hopeful." He reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "Do you ever think about going back to Ohio?" "There's nothing to go back to," Harriet said. "My parents died of influenza the winter after I left. My brother moved to Chicago. I have no one there, no reason to return." She looked around at the half-built cabin, the meadow beyond, the mountains rising in the distance. "This is home now, for better or worse. Then we'll make it better," Cole said with conviction. "We'll build something here that's worth staying for." By mid-June, the cabin had walls and a roof, though the interior still needed work. Cole had designed it with care. One large room with a stone fireplace, a loft for sleeping, windows positioned to catch the morning light. It was smaller than Harriet's cabin, but sturdier, built with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of permanence rather than temporary shelter. "I was thinking," Cole said one evening as they sat on what would eventually be his front porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, "that maybe we could add a covered walkway between the two cabins. For when the weather's bad and we need to go back and forth." Harriet looked at him. Seeing the future he was sketching out with his words, a life where they lived separately but together, independent but connected. "The town would have a fit," she said, though without real objection. "The town has been having a fit since December," Cole pointed out. "At this point, I think we've given them enough material for years of gossip. Might as well make ourselves comfortable in the process." "You're terrible," Harriet said, but she was smiling. "I'm practical," Cole corrected. "And I'm planning for winter. You remember that blizzard in February? I nearly lost my toes walking through those drifts. A covered walkway means I can check on you without freezing to death. The casual way he talked about checking on her, about being there through another winter and the ones after that, made something warm bloom in Harriet's chest. She reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. A covered walkway sounds perfect, she said softly. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue. And for those few minutes, Harriet let herself believe that maybe the curse really was just superstition. Maybe she could have this, a future with a good man, a home that felt safe, a life that extended beyond mere survival. The first real threat came in July. Though not in the form anyone expected, Harriet had gone into town for supplies, her first trip to Silver Ridge proper in over a year. She'd been avoiding it, sending Timothy the delivery boy or asking Cole to pick up what she needed. But she'd run out of thread colors that she needed for a commission, and the merchant who supplied Timothy didn't carry what she required. So she'd steeled herself, put on her plainest dress, and made the journey into town with her head held high and her spine straight. The general store fell silent when she walked in. Conversations died mid-sentence, and every eye turned to watch her move through the aisles. Harriet ignored them, focusing on finding her thread, making her selections, and paying for her purchases. She was almost to the door when a woman's voice stopped her cold. "Shame on you, Harriet Brennan." Harriet turned to find Margaret Peterson, wife of the saloon keeper, head of the church ladies' auxiliary, and unofficial moral guardian of Silver Ridge, standing with her arms crossed and her face twisted in righteous anger. "Shame on you for bringing that poor boy into your web," Margaret continued, her voice carrying through the store. "Cole Madsen is a good man, a decent man, and you're going to get him killed just like the others. You should have the decency to send him away before your curse takes him too." Harriet felt every eye in the store on her, felt the weight of their judgment and fear. Part of her wanted to run, to flee back to her cabin and never venture into town again. But another part, the part that Cole had helped strengthen over the past months, refused to be cowed. "Cole Madsen is a grown man capable of making his own choices," Harriet said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "And he's chosen to be my friend. That's between him and me, Mrs. Peterson, not you or anyone else in this town." "Friend," Margaret scoffed. "Everyone knows it's more than friendship. Everyone knows he's building that cabin on your property, spending every spare moment out there with you. And everyone knows how this story ends." "No," Harriet said quietly. "You don't know how this story ends. None of you do. You've decided I'm cursed, decided I'm dangerous, because it's easier than admitting that sometimes tragedy strikes without reason or warning. You need someone to blame, and I'm convenient." She took a step toward Margaret, gratified when the older woman stepped back. "But I'm done accepting your judgment. I'm done hiding because you're afraid. Cole isn't afraid of me, and I'm learning not to be afraid of myself." She left the store with her head high, though her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped her packages. She made it to her horse, secured her purchases, and was about to mount when she heard footsteps behind her. "Mrs. Brennan." "Harriet?" She turned to find Dr. Samuel Wright, the same doctor who'd examined all three of her dead husbands, standing a few feet away. He was in his 50s now, with gray hair and tired eyes, and he held his medical bag like a shield. "I don't need a doctor," Harriet said warily. "I know." Dr. Wright glanced around, as if checking to see who might be watching, then lowered his voice. "I need to speak with you. About your husbands." Harriet's blood went cold. "What about them?" "Not here," the doctor said urgently. "Come to my office, please. There's something you need to know, something I should have told you years ago." Every instinct screamed at Harriet to refuse, to get on her horse and ride away from whatever revelation the doctor was offering. But the look in his eyes stopped her, not judgment or fear, but guilt, deep gnawing guilt that had clearly been eating at him for some time. "When?" she asked. "Now, if you can spare the time. This has waited too long already." Harriet tied her horse to the rail and followed Dr. Wright through the back streets of Silver Ridge to his office, a small building attached to his home. He locked the door behind them, closed the curtains, and gestured for her to sit in one of the chairs facing his desk. "What is this about?" Harriet demanded, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and confused hope. Dr. Wright sat heavily in his own chair, setting his medical bag aside with trembling hands. For a long moment he just looked at her, and Harriet could see him wrestling with something, deciding how to begin, or perhaps deciding whether to begin at all. Finally he spoke. "Your first husband, Thomas Whitmore. I ruled his death an accident, a blow to the head, drowning in the creek. That was the truth, or at least part of it." "Part of it?" Harriet leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there were things about his injuries that didn't quite add up," Dr. Wright said slowly. "The angle of the blow, the force required to create such damage. I mentioned my concerns to Thomas's father, suggesting that perhaps the horse hadn't thrown him, that perhaps someone had struck him. But Mr. Whitmore was grief-stricken, and he wanted it to be an accident. He wanted closure, and I let him convince me I was seeing things that weren't there." Harriet's mouth went dry. "You think someone killed Thomas?" "I didn't know what to think," the doctor admitted. "Not until your second husband died. Daniel Forrester, heart failure in a young, healthy man. It happens, certainly, but it's rare, very rare. And when I examined him, there was something about the way his pupils were dilated, something about the color of his skin." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I suggested we test for certain substances, but Daniel's father refused. He said I was trying to turn a tragedy into a scandal, that his son had simply had an undiagnosed heart condition." "Substances," Harriet repeated. "You mean poison?" Dr. Wright met her eyes. "I mean, I had suspicions I wasn't allowed to investigate. And then came your third husband, Jonathan Hayes. No marks, no obvious cause of death, just a healthy man who stopped breathing for no apparent reason. By then, the town had already decided you were cursed. And honestly, Mrs. Brennan, I was half convinced myself. 3 dead husbands defied all logic and probability, so why are you telling me this now?" Harriet's voice was sharp with anger and fear. "Why wait 8 years to share your suspicions?" "Because I'm a coward," Dr. Wright said simply. "Because I let this town's superstition override my professional judgment. Because I was afraid of what it might mean if I looked too closely at those deaths and found something that contradicted the curse narrative." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "But Cole Madsen isn't a coward. He's been asking questions all over town, about you, about your husbands, about the circumstances of their deaths. And yesterday he came to see me." Harriet's heart skipped. "Cole came to you?" "He did. He wanted to know the medical details of each death, whether I'd noticed any patterns, whether I thought the deaths were truly natural." Dr. Wright smiled slightly. "He's a persistent man, your Mr. Madsen, and he made me realize that I owe you the truth, even if it comes 8 years too late." "What truth?" Harriet whispered. "The truth is that I don't believe you're cursed," Dr. Wright said firmly. "I believe someone murdered your husband, Mrs. Brennan, all 3 of them. And I believe that whoever did it is still in Silver Ridge, watching you, waiting to see if history will repeat itself with Cole Madsen." The words hung in the air between them, transforming everything Harriet thought she knew about her life. Not cursed, murdered. Someone in Silver Ridge had killed Thomas and Daniel and Jonathan, had stolen them from her, and let her carry the blame and the guilt and the crushing weight of a curse that had never been real. Who? The word came out as barely more than a breath. Who would do such a thing? That, Dr. Wright said grimly, is what we need to figure out. Before Cole Madsen becomes the 4th victim. Harriet rode back to her cabin in a daze, Dr. Wright's words echoing in her mind like a death knell. Murdered. All 3 of them. Not a curse, not fate, not some cosmic punishment for the sin of daring to be happy. Someone had deliberately taken Thomas and Daniel and Jonathan from her, had watched her grieve and suffer and withdraw from the world, had allowed an entire town to brand her as cursed while they walked free. The rage that swept through her was so sudden and fierce that she had to stop her horse halfway home, dismounting to pace along the road until her hands stopped shaking. 8 years. 8 years of isolation and shame and crushing guilt, all built on a lie. 8 years of believing she was poison, that love and death were intertwined in her very being, that anyone who came close to her was doomed. And someone in Silver Ridge knew the truth, had known it all along. Cole was working on the cabin when she arrived, fitting the last of the interior boards into place. He looked up at the sound of her horse, and his smile faded instantly when he saw her face. What happened? He was off the ladder and at her side in seconds, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes searching hers with concern. "Harriet, what's wrong?" She told him everything, about the confrontation with Margaret Peterson, about Dr. Wright's revelation, about the suspicions that had been buried under small-town politics and fear. Cole listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each word, until by the end his jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "Murder," he said flatly when she finished. "Someone's been murdering your husbands and letting you take the blame. Dr. Wright said you'd been asking questions in town," Harriet said, studying his face. "Why didn't you tell me?" Cole had the grace to look sheepish. "Because I didn't want to give you false hope. I had suspicions. The timing of the deaths, the lack of clear causes, the way this whole curse narrative seemed too convenient. But suspicions aren't proof. I wanted to gather information before saying anything to you." He cupped her face gently. "I'm sorry. I should have told you what I was doing. You were trying to protect me," Harriet said softly. "I understand. But Cole, if someone murdered them, if someone is capable of that," fear closed her throat. "You have to leave. You have to get as far from me as possible before—" "Stop!" Cole's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "I'm not leaving, and we're not having this conversation again. If someone's been killing your husbands, then we're going to find out who and make sure they face justice. Together." "Together," Harriet repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue after so many years of solitary suffering. "Together," Cole confirmed. "Now let's think this through logically. Who would want to harm you by killing the men you loved? Who benefits from you being isolated and branded as cursed?" Harriet sank onto the steps of Cole's unfinished cabin, trying to force her churning thoughts into order. "I don't know. I can't think of anyone who would hate me enough to—" She stopped, a memory surfacing. "Thomas's brother," Cole sat beside her. "Tell me, William Whitmore." He was 2 years older than Thomas, and he always assumed he'd inherit the family ranch. But when Thomas married me, his father changed his will, made Thomas the primary heir. William was furious. He cornered me at the wedding reception, told me I'd stolen his birthright, that I'd regret coming between him and what was rightfully his. Harriet pressed her hands to her temples, trying to remember details she'd buried long ago. After Thomas died, the inheritance reverted to William. I never thought. I was so consumed with grief that I never questioned it. Where is William Whitmore now? Cole asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Still in Silver Ridge, as far as I know. He runs the family ranch. I haven't seen him in years. I avoid the north end of town where the Whitmore property is." Harriet looked at Cole. "You think he killed Thomas for the inheritance?" "It's a strong motive," Cole said. "But what about your other husbands? Daniel Forrester and Jonathan Hayes. What did William Whitmore have to gain from their deaths?" "Nothing that I can see," Harriet admitted. "Daniel was a banker's son, and Jonathan was a surveyor with no family money. Killing them wouldn't have benefited William financially." Cole stood, pacing the length of the porch as he thought. Maybe it wasn't about money after the first death. Maybe it became about something else. Power, control, revenge. Or maybe, he turned to look at her, maybe someone else had a different motive for the second and third murders. We might be looking for more than one killer. The thought made Harriet's stomach turn. Multiple people wanting me to suffer? Or multiple people who benefit from you being isolated and afraid, Cole said grimly. Think about it, Harriet. Your first husband's death gave William an inheritance, but your second and third husband's deaths accomplished something else. They cemented your reputation as cursed, ensured that no one in this town would ever come near you again. But who would want that? Harriet stood, frustration and fear warring in her chest. Who gains from my isolation? That's what we need to find out. Cole reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Tomorrow, I'm going to start asking more direct questions. Someone in this town knows something, and I'm going to find out who. It could be dangerous, Harriet warned. If the killer realizes you're investigating, then they'll know I'm not as easy a target as your previous husbands were, Cole said with a grim smile. I'm not some unsuspecting victim, Harriet. I've spent my whole life around dangerous men, worked cattle drives through hostile territory, dealt with rustlers and thieves and worse. Whoever's behind this is going to find I'm a harder mark than they expect. That night, Harriet lay awake in her cabin, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the seismic shift in her understanding of her own life. Every memory was tainted now, every moment of grief and guilt, reframed through the lens of murder. Someone had orchestrated her suffering, had crafted her isolation with 3 carefully planned deaths. The question was, who? Cole began his investigation the next morning, starting with the most obvious suspect. He rode to the Whitmore ranch just after dawn, finding William Whitmore supervising the branding of spring calves in the north pasture. William was a thick-set man in his 40s now, with thinning hair and the florid complexion of someone who drank too much. He looked up at Cole's approach with obvious suspicion. "Help you with something?" William's tone made it clear he considered Cole's presence an intrusion. "Name's Cole Madsen. I'm working on the McClintock spread." Cole dismounted, approaching with the easy confidence of a man who knew how to handle himself. "I wanted to ask you some questions about your brother's death." William's expression hardened. "That was 13 years ago. What business is it of yours?" "I'm courting Harriet Brennan," Cole said bluntly, watching William's face for a reaction. "And I've been hearing stories about how all her husbands end up dead. I thought I should know what I'm getting into." Something flickered in William's eyes. Satisfaction, maybe, or vindication. "Then you're a fool. That woman is cursed, pure and simple. Killed my brother, just like she killed the others. If you've got any sense, you'll stay far away from her. How exactly did she kill your brother?" Cole pressed. "I heard he fell from his horse and drowned. Ought to see how his wife caused that from miles away. Who knows how witchcraft works?" William spat. "All I know is my brother married her, and 3 weeks later he was dead. The ranch should have been mine by rights anyway. I was the eldest. Thomas only got it because father was soft on him, let him make foolish decisions like marrying some nobody from Ohio." "So you got the ranch in the end," Cole observed. "Must have worked out well for you." William's face darkened. "You accusing me of something?" "Just making conversation." Cole's tone was mild, but his eyes were sharp. "Seems like you benefited from your brother's death, that's all." "I loved Thomas," William said, his voice rising. "Loved him despite his poor choices, and I've run this ranch better than he ever could have. Now get off my property before I have my men throw you off." Cole left, but not before noting the way William's hands had clenched into fists when talking about Thomas. The barely concealed anger that still simmered after more than a decade. William Whitmore had motive and opportunity for the first murder, that much was clear. But whether he'd actually killed his brother remained uncertain. The next stop was Daniel Forrester's family. Daniel's father had died 5 years earlier, but his mother still lived in the family home on the east side of Silver Ridge. Mrs. Forrester was a small, brittle woman in her 60s who answered the door with obvious reluctance when Cole knocked. "I don't talk about Daniel," she said when Cole explained his purpose. "It's too painful, and there's nothing to say that hasn't already been said." "I understand, ma'am. I'm just trying to understand what happened to him. The doctor said heart failure, but the doctor said what needed to be said." Mrs. Forrester interrupted, her voice sharp. "My Daniel died of natural causes, and that woman had nothing to do with it." Cole frowned. "You don't believe Harriet Brennan cursed him?" "I don't believe in curses," Mrs. Forrester said firmly. "I believe my son had a weak heart that no one knew about, and I believe he died because God called him home. Harriet was a good wife to him, and I won't have people saying otherwise. Her expression softened slightly. "She tried to visit me after the funeral, you know. Wanted to return some of Daniel's belongings, to talk about him. But I couldn't bear to see her. Couldn't bear to be reminded of what I'd lost. I sent her away, and I've regretted it ever since. Did Daniel have any enemies?" Cole asked gently. "Anyone who might have wished him harm?" Mrs. Forrester's brow furrowed. "Why would you ask such a thing?" "Just being thorough, ma'am." Daniel was a banker. He dealt with people's money, handled loans and foreclosures. There were certainly people who weren't happy with him. Farmers who couldn't pay their mortgages, businessmen who were denied credit. But enemies? She shook her head. No one who would kill him, if that's what you're suggesting. Do you remember anyone in particular who had a grievance around the time of his death? Mrs. Forrester thought for a moment. There was a rancher, Matthews, I think his name was. His spread had failed, and the bank foreclosed. He made quite a scene, threatened Daniel in front of half the town. But that was a month before Daniel died, and I heard Matthews moved to Wyoming shortly after. Cole thanked her and left, his mind churning. A foreclosure could be a powerful motive, but if Matthews had left the territory, he couldn't have killed Jonathan Hayes 8 years later, unless he spent the rest of the day tracking down information about other people who might have had grudges against Daniel or Jonathan. A picture began to emerge, not a clear one, but suggestive nonetheless. Daniel had handled several foreclosures in the months before his death, including properties that were then purchased at auction by wealthier families in Silver Ridge. Jonathan's surveying work had involved disputed land claims, boundary disagreements that sometimes resulted in families losing acreage they'd considered theirs for generations. Both men had made enemies through their work. Small enemies, perhaps, people who'd been angry or bitter, but not necessarily murderous, unless combined with something else. Some additional motivation that turned resentment into lethal action. Cole was riding back toward Harriet's cabin as the sun began to set, when he saw something that made him rein in his horse. A man on horseback was approaching Harriet's property from the south, moving slowly, as if surveying the land. In the fading light, Cole couldn't make out details, but something about the figure's posture struck him as furtive, secretive. He urged his horse forward, closing the distance at a gallop. The stranger heard him coming and wheeled his mount around, spurring into a run back the way he'd come. Cole gave chase, but the other rider had a head start and knew the terrain. Within minutes, horse and rider had disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Cole with nothing but questions and a growing sense of urgency. Someone was watching Harriet's cabin. Someone was interested enough to skulk around the property at dusk, and nervous enough to flee when confronted. Cole reached Harriet's cabin to find her standing on the porch with a rifle in her hands, her face pale in the lamplight spilling from the open door. "I saw someone," she said before Cole could speak, "watching from the tree line. When I came out with the rifle, they rode off." "Who was it?" "I don't know," Cole admitted, dismounting and climbing the steps to stand beside her. "But they were on the south side when I spotted them." "Could be the same person you saw. They're getting bolder," Harriet said, her voice trembling slightly. "Whoever they are." Cole took the rifle from her hands and set it aside, then pulled her into his arms. She came willingly, pressing her face against his chest while he held her tight. "We're going to figure this out," he promised. "We're going to find whoever's responsible and make sure they can never hurt you again." "What if we can't?" Harriet whispered. "What if they get to you first?" "They won't," Cole said with absolute conviction, "because now I know they're coming and I'll be ready. We both will be." But even as he spoke the words, Cole felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. Somewhere in Silver Ridge, a killer walked free. Someone who'd murdered 3 times and gotten away with it. Someone who might be preparing to kill again, and Cole Madsen had just made himself the most obvious target. Cole didn't sleep that night. He moved his bedroll from his unfinished cabin to Harriet's porch, positioning himself where he could watch the approaches to the property. The rifle lay across his lap, loaded and ready, while the moon traced its arc across the sky, and the night sounds of the Montana wilderness filled the darkness around him. Harriet had protested, saying he needed rest, that he couldn't guard her every moment. But Cole had been unmovable. Someone was circling them like a wolf around wounded prey, and he'd be damned if he'd let them strike while he slept comfortably 50 yards away. Around 3 in the morning, he heard it, the soft crunch of boots on grass, moving with deliberate care. Cole remained perfectly still, his hand tightening on the rifle as he watched the shadows at the edge of the tree line. A figure emerged, darker than the darkness around it, moving toward the cabin with slow, measured steps. Cole waited until the intruder was 20 feet away, then cocked the rifle with a sound that split the night like thunder. "That's close enough," he called out, his voice carrying across the still air. "Step into the moonlight where I can see you, and keep your hands where I can watch them." The figure froze, and for a moment Cole thought they might bolt. Then slowly, hands raised, the person moved into a patch of moonlight near Harriet's garden fence. It was a woman. She was in her 40s, dressed in plain clothing with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her face was lined with worry and exhaustion, and her eyes were wide with fear as she stared at the rifle pointed in her direction. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't shoot. I just need to talk to Mrs. Brennan." The cabin door opened behind Cole, and Harriet emerged with a lamp in her hand, its light pushing back the darkness. She held the lamp up, illuminating the woman's face, and Cole heard her sharp intake of breath. "Ellen?" Harriet's voice was full of confusion. "Ellen Matthews?" The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Harriet. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what else to do." Cole lowered the rifle slightly but didn't set it aside. "You want to explain what you're doing, skulking around this property in the middle of the night?" "I've been trying to work up the courage to come here for weeks," Ellen said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Ever since I heard that you were courting someone new. I had to warn you, had to tell you the truth before—" She broke off, sobbing. Harriet descended the porch steps slowly, setting the lamp on a fence post. "Ellen, I haven't seen you in 10 years. What truth are you talking about?" Ellen Matthews wrapped her arms around herself, trembling despite the warm summer night. "My husband, Robert. You remember him. He owned the ranch east of town, the one that the bank foreclosed on." "I remember," Harriet said quietly. "Daniel handled that foreclosure. Your husband threatened him." "Robert did more than threaten him," Ellen whispered. "He killed him, Harriet. He poisoned Daniel Forrester, and I've carried that secret for 11 years. The words hung in the air like smoke, choking and thick. Cole stood, moving down the steps to stand beside Harriet, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "Tell us everything," Cole said, his voice hard as iron. "Every detail. From the beginning." Ellen sank to the ground as if her legs could no longer hold her, sitting in the dirt with her back against the fence. In the lamplight, she looked far older than her years, worn down by the weight of the secret she'd carried. "We lost everything," she began, her voice hollow. "The drought killed our cattle, the bank called in our loans, and Daniel Forrester followed the rules to the letter. No extensions, no mercy. Robert begged him, told him we had 3 children to feed, nowhere else to go. But Daniel said the decision was out of his hands, that the bank had policies that had to be followed." She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. "Robert became someone I didn't recognize after we lost the ranch. He was consumed with rage, obsessed with revenge. He started drinking, started talking about how Daniel Forrester had ruined us, taken everything we'd built. I thought it was just talk, the bitter words of a broken man. Then one day, about a month after we'd moved into a rented room above the feed store, Robert came home with a small bottle. Said he'd gotten it from a traveling medicine man who'd passed through town. What was in the bottle?" Cole asked. "Something from plants, I think. Robert wouldn't tell me exactly. He said it would stop a man's heart without leaving a trace, making it look like natural death. I told him he was mad, that he couldn't—" Ellen's voice broke. "But he did it anyway. He went to the bank on a Wednesday afternoon, pretending he needed to discuss something with Daniel. I don't know how he got the poison into Daniel's system, slipped it into his coffee maybe, or his lunch. But Daniel collapsed at his desk 2 hours later, and by the time the doctor arrived, he was dead." Harriet's grip on Cole's hand tightened until her nails dug into his palm. You knew this and said nothing? I was terrified, Ellen said, fresh tears streaming. Robert told me if I breathed a word of it, he'd kill me too, kill our children. He said no one would believe me anyway, that I'd be hanged as an accomplice if I talked. So I stayed quiet, and I watched you grieve, and I hated myself for it. She looked up at Harriet, her face twisted with anguish. Then you married Jonathan Hayes, and Robert started talking again about how some people didn't deserve happiness, how you'd taken everything from us and now had the gall to be happy again. I never imagined he killed Jonathan too, Cole said flatly. It wasn't a question. Ellen nodded miserably. I didn't know for certain until after it happened, but when I heard Jonathan was dead with no apparent cause, I knew. I confronted Robert and he admitted it, said he'd used the same poison, said you needed to understand what loss felt like, what it meant to have everything taken away. She looked at Harriet with desperate eyes. I wanted to tell you, wanted to confess and face whatever consequences came, but Robert watched me constantly, never let me out of his sight for more than a few minutes. And then, 6 months after Jonathan died, Robert got drunk and fell into the mill pond. They ruled it an accident, but I've always wondered if someone else had decided he needed to pay, Cole finished. Where have you been all these years, Mrs. Matthews? Why come forward now? We moved to Helena after Robert died, Ellen said. I couldn't stay in Silver Ridge, couldn't face you, couldn't bear the weight of what I knew. I've been working as a seamstress there, raising my children, trying to live with guilt. She drew a shuddering breath. But then my oldest son came back from a visit to Silver Ridge 2 weeks ago. He told me about you, Mr. Madsen, about how you were courting Harriet, how the town was taking bets on when you'd die. And I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. If there was even a chance that someone else was continuing what Robert started, I had to warn you. Wait, Harriet said sharply. What do you mean continuing what Robert started? Robert killed Daniel and Jonathan, but he couldn't have killed Thomas. Thomas died 3 years before the foreclosure. Ellen's face went pale. Thomas Whitmore? I assumed Robert had killed all 3. No, Cole said slowly, his mind racing. Thomas's death predates your husband's motive by years, which means we're looking at 2 different killers after all. He turned to Ellen. Did your husband ever mention Thomas Whitmore? Ever talk about Harriet's first husband? Never, Ellen said. When he ranted about Harriet, it was always about how she'd moved on, found new happiness while we suffered. He never mentioned her first husband at all. Cole looked at Harriet, seeing his own realization reflected in her eyes. Thomas's murder had been different, financially motivated, tied to an inheritance. But Daniel and Jonathan had been killed by a man seeking revenge against Harriet herself, punishing her for daring to find love again after his own life had crumbled. 2 killers. 2 different motives. And Robert Matthews was dead, which meant the threat he'd posed had ended 6 years ago. But Thomas's killer, whoever had struck that first blow and set this entire nightmare in motion, was still out there. Mrs. Matthews, Cole said carefully, did your husband know William Whitmore? Were they friends, associates, anything like that? Ellen shook her head. Robert blamed the bank, not the Whitmores. He never spoke about William one way or another. They talked for another hour, with Ellen providing every detail she could remember about Robert's state of mind, his actions in the weeks before each murder, anything that might be relevant. By the time she left, promising to put her confession in writing and send it to the territorial marshal, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Harriet stood in her garden, staring at the mountains as the world slowly emerged from darkness. Cole came to stand beside her, exhaustion pulling at his bones, but his mind still racing with implications. 2 killers, Harriet said softly. All this time I thought it was one person, one curse. But it was 2 separate people with 2 separate reasons to destroy my life. Robert Matthews is dead, Cole reminded her. He can't hurt anyone anymore, but William Whitmore isn't. Harriet turned to face him. And if he killed Thomas for the inheritance, what's to stop him from killing you? You're not family. He gains nothing from your death except the satisfaction of ensuring I stay isolated and miserable. Unless there's something else we're missing, Cole said thoughtfully. William gained the ranch when Thomas died, that's clear. But what's his situation now? Is he still running it successfully, or has something changed? I have no idea, Harriet admitted. I've avoided anything to do with the Whitmore family for years. Then it's time to find out, Cole said. And I know just who to ask. That afternoon, Cole rode back into Silver Ridge and straight to the land office, a small building near the courthouse where property records were kept. The clerk was a nervous young man named Peter, who'd recently taken the position after the previous clerk retired. They need to see the property records for the Whitmore ranch, Cole said, leaning against the counter with what he hoped was a casual air. Just curious about the history of some of the big spreads in the area. Peter adjusted his spectacles nervously. Those records are public, but may I ask why you're interested? The Whitmores are an important family, and I'm thinking about buying land in the area, Cole lied smoothly. Want to know what properties might come available? What the going prices are? The Whitmore spread is one of the largest, so it seems like a good place to start research. Mollified, Peter pulled out a heavy ledger and began flipping through pages. Let's see. Whitmore Ranch, Northern Territory. Originally granted to Chester Whitmore in 1865, passed to his son Thomas in 1877. He ran his finger down the page. Thomas died in 1878. Property reverted to William Whitmore. Then in 1883, William took out a mortgage against the property with the First Bank of Silver Ridge. Another mortgage in 1886. And Peter's finger stopped. Interesting. What? Cole leaned forward. Foreclosure notice filed in February of this year, Peter said, looking up with surprise. The bank is calling in William's loans. He's got until the end of September to pay them off, or he loses the ranch. He flipped to another section. And according to this, the bank has already lined up a buyer, some cattle company from the east looking to expand into Montana territory. Cole felt pieces clicking into place in his mind. How much does William owe? Peter checked the records. $23,000. It was a staggering sum, more money than most people would see in a lifetime. William Whitmore was on the verge of losing everything he'd killed his brother to obtain, facing the same kind of financial ruin that had driven Robert Matthews to murder. One more question, Cole said. Who holds those mortgages? Who does William owe the money to? Peter consulted the ledger again. The First Bank of Silver Ridge. It says here the loans were approved by... He squinted at the faded handwriting. Daniel Forster. The world seemed to tilt beneath Cole's feet. Daniel Forrester had held William Whitmore's financial future in his hands. Daniel, who'd been Harriet's second husband. Daniel, whom William would have known from business dealings in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's affairs. Is there a record of when those loans were approved? Cole asked, his voice tight. The first one in 1883, shortly after William inherited. The second in 1886, Peter looked up. Why, is something wrong? No, Cole said, forcing a casual smile. Just doing my research. Thank you for your help. He left the land office with his mind spinning. The picture was becoming clearer, though the details were still murky. William had killed Thomas for the inheritance, that much seemed certain. But then he'd run the ranch poorly, or had bad luck with weather and markets, eventually requiring loans from the bank. Loans approved by Daniel Forrester, who then married William's brother's widow. Had William killed Daniel too? Not out of revenge like Robert Matthews, but to prevent Daniel from calling in the loans, to buy himself more time? And Jonathan, a surveyor who would have been involved in verifying property boundaries, who might have known if William was trying to sell off pieces of the ranch illegally or extend his boundaries beyond what he actually owned. It made a horrible kind of sense. Not two killers, but three murders by William Whitmore, each serving a different purpose. Thomas for inheritance, Daniel to protect his financial interests, Jonathan to hide his desperate attempts to save a failing ranch. Cole rode hard back to Harriet's cabin, arriving as the sun was setting. She was waiting on the porch, and the moment she saw his face, she knew he'd learned something significant. William Whitmore is about to lose his ranch, Cole said without preamble. dismounting and climbing the steps in 3 long strides. He's mortgaged to the hilt, the bank is foreclosing, and he's got less than 2 months to come up with $23,000 or he loses everything. Harriet's eyes widened. The ranch he killed Thomas to get. The ranch he killed Thomas to get, took out loans to maintain, and may have killed Daniel and Jonathan to protect. Cole took her hands. Harriet, I think it was William all along. All 3 murders. But Ellen said Robert killed Daniel and Jonathan, Harriet protested. She was certain. She was certain her husband poisoned them, Cole corrected. But what if he wasn't the only one with access to poison? What if William was the one who actually administered it, and Robert just happened to have obtained poison around the same time? It's a coincidence, certainly, but not impossible. Harriet shook her head slowly. Ellen said Robert confessed to her. Why would he confess to murders he didn't commit? To protect himself from suspicion of something else? Cole suggested. To appear powerful, dangerous, when he was really just a broken man ranting. Or maybe, he paused thinking, maybe he really did plan to kill Daniel, but William got there first. Matthews could have been bragging about something he intended to do, not something he'd actually accomplished. This is making my head spin, Harriet said, sinking into a chair. 2 confessions, 3 dead men, and we still don't know for certain who killed whom. Then we need to find proof, Cole said firmly. Real proof, not just circumstantial connections and theories. He knelt in front of her chair, looking up into her face. Harriet, I need you to think carefully. In the days and weeks before each of your husbands died, did you see William Whitmore? Did he come around, visit, interact with any of them? Harriet closed her eyes, thinking back through years of memories. Thomas? Yes, William came to our house several times after the wedding. He and Thomas argued about the ranch, about management decisions. I served them coffee once. Her eyes flew open. Cole, I served them coffee. What if William put something in Thomas's cup when I wasn't looking? What about Daniel? William did business at the bank. He would have seen Daniel there, could have had opportunities. Harriet's voice was shaking now. And Jonathan, William hired him to survey some disputed boundaries on the ranch property. Jonathan came home talking about it, said William seemed nervous about the results, and kept asking whether the survey would be made public, because if the survey showed William had been claiming land that wasn't his, or selling land he didn't own, it would ruin him, Cole said. Jonathan's survey could have exposed fraud that would have destroyed William's credibility and accelerated the foreclosure. They stared at each other in the gathering darkness, the full horror of it settling over them like a shroud. William Whitmore had murdered 3 men over 13 years, each killing carefully planned to serve his own interests. And he'd let Harriet bear the blame and the curse and the crushing isolation that came with being branded as death's companion. We have to go to the marshal, Harriet said. We have to tell him everything we've learned. We will, Cole promised. First thing tomorrow, we ride to the marshal's office and lay out everything. Ellen's confession about her husband's intentions. The financial records showing William's motive. The connections between all 3 victims. It's circumstantial, but it's enough to warrant an investigation. And if William finds out we're accusing him, before the marshal can arrest him. Cole's expression hardened. Then he's going to discover that I'm not some unsuspecting victim he can poison in the dark. I'm ready for him, Harriet. And this time, the story ends differently. But even as he spoke the words with conviction, Cole couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. William Whitmore had killed 3 times and evaded justice for more than a decade. He was desperate now, cornered by financial ruin, with nothing left to lose, and desperate men were the most dangerous kind of all. They never made it to the marshal's office. Cole woke before dawn to the smell of smoke. Not the clean scent of a cooking fire, but the acrid, dangerous smell of burning wood and thatch. He rolled off Harriet's porch where he'd been sleeping and saw flames licking up the side of his nearly completed cabin, orange and hungry in the pre-dawn darkness. "Harriet!" He pounded on her door.
"Fire, get out now!"
She emerged within seconds, still in her nightdress, her eyes wide with shock as she took in the burning cabin. But Cole was already running toward it, not to save the structure. It was clearly beyond saving, but because he'd seen something in the firelight that made his blood run cold. A figure standing in the shadows beyond the flames. "Watching! Show yourself!" Cole shouted, changing direction to circle around the fire. "I know you're there, Whitmore." The figure stepped into the flickering light, and Cole's suspicions were confirmed. William Whitmore stood 50 feet away, a rifle cradled in his arms. His face twisted, with something between rage and desperation. "You couldn't leave well enough alone," William called out, his voice rough with drink or exhaustion or both. "You had to start asking questions, digging up the past, convincing that Matthews woman to talk." "Ellen told us everything," Cole said, edging sideways to keep himself between William and Harriet's cabin. "About her husband's plans, about the poison. But we figured out the rest ourselves. The inheritance, the loans, the foreclosure. You killed your own brother for a ranch you couldn't even keep." William's laugh was bitter and broken. Thomas was weak. "Father should have given me the ranch from the beginning. I was the eldest. It was my birthright. But no, Thomas was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. And then he married that woman, and Father changed everything, gave it all to Thomas, like I didn't exist." He spat in the dirt. "I did what needed to be done. Found him checking the fence line that morning and hit him hard enough to crack his skull. Held him down in that creek until he stopped struggling. Made it look like an accident. Harriet had come out of her cabin despite Cole's warning, and her gasp carried across the yard. William's eyes swung toward her, and Cole saw his finger move closer to the rifle's trigger. "You destroyed my life," William said, his voice rising. "Everything I did was because of you. If you'd just died with Thomas, if you'd had the decency to drown yourself in grief, none of the rest would have been necessary. But no, you had to find new husbands, had to keep living, keep existing, when you should have been buried alongside my brother." "Daniel Forrester," Cole said, trying to draw William's attention back to him. "You killed him because he held your loans, because you were afraid he'd call them in." "He was asking too many questions about my finances," William admitted. "I wanted documentation I couldn't provide, numbers that didn't add up. And having him married to her," he gestured toward Harriet with the rifle barrel, "was an insult I couldn't stomach. Thomas's widow playing house with the man who held my fate in his hands. So yes, I poisoned his coffee one afternoon at the bank. Wolfsbane, distilled down to a few drops. Stopped the heart without leaving a trace. I learned about it from a book on native plants. And Jonathan Hayes?" Harriet's voice was steadier than Cole expected. "What did he do to deserve death?" "He surveyed my property and found discrepancies," William said flatly. "Found places where I'd moved boundary markers to claim an extra 100 acres here and there. Places where I'd sold off parcels that technically belonged to my neighbors. He was going to file an official report exposing my fraud to the territorial authorities. I couldn't let that happen. It would have accelerated the foreclosure and destroyed what little credit I had left. So I invited him to the ranch to discuss his findings, and I slipped the same poison into his whiskey. The casual way he described the murders, 3 men dead, 3 lives snuffed out like candles, made Cole's stomach turn. But he kept his voice level, kept William talking while he tried to figure out how to end this without anyone else dying. "Robert Matthews didn't kill anyone," Cole said. "He just talked about it." "Matthews was a useful fool," William agreed. "When I heard him ranting in the saloon about killing Daniel Forrester, I knew he'd make a perfect scapegoat if anyone ever questioned the deaths. And when he conveniently drowned himself drunk, it tied up that loose end nicely." He smiled, and there was something terrifying in the expression. "I've been very careful for 13 years. Covered my tracks, let the town believe in curses and bad luck. And it worked perfectly until you showed up, Madsen. So what's your plan now?" Cole asked. "Kill me? Add another body to your collection?" "That was the idea," William said. "Burn your cabin, ambush you when you try to save it, make it look like you died in the fire. Then burn hers too," he nodded toward Harriet's cabin, "with her inside it. End this whole sorry chapter once and for all." Let the town say the curse finally consumed her, that she burned with her lover like they deserved. Except I'm standing right here, Cole pointed out, armed and ready, with a witness who's heard every word of your confession. A confession means nothing without proof, and a witness means nothing if she's dead. William raised the rifle, pointing it directly at Harriet. You've ruined my life, Harriet Brennan. Cost me everything. Time to pay your debt. Cole moved without thinking, diving toward Harriet as William's finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle cracked, and Cole felt something hot tear across his shoulder, pain exploding through his arm. He crashed into Harriet, bearing her to the ground behind a water trough, as a second shot splintered the wood above their heads. "Stay down!" Cole gasped, pressing his hand to his bleeding shoulder. The wound wasn't deep. The bullet had grazed him rather than punching through, but it hurt like hellfire, and his arm was already going weak. William was advancing now, working the rifle's lever action, his face illuminated by the flames of the burning cabin. "Come out and face justice, Madsen. Face what you've brought upon yourself." But Cole had no intention of making himself an easy target. He rolled away from the water trough, coming up behind Harriet's woodpile with his own rifle, the one he'd kept on the porch, gripped in his good hand. His wounded shoulder screamed in protest as he brought the weapon to bear, but his aim was steady. "Drop it, Whitmore," he shouted. "Drop the rifle and surrender. It's over. It's not over until you're both dead." William fired again, the bullet kicking up splinters from the woodpile. "I've killed 3 men. What's 2 more? I'm already damned, already ruined. Might as well finish what I started." He was moving erratically now, circling toward where Harriet still crouched behind the water trough, and Cole realized with cold certainty that William had chosen his next target. If Cole took the shot and missed, William would have a clear line to Harriet. If he didn't take the shot, William would get there anyway. Cole made his choice. He stood, drawing William's fire, making himself the obvious threat. The rifle cracked, and he felt something punch into his side, a blow that drove the air from his lungs and sent him staggering backward. But he kept his feet, kept his weapon raised, and fired once. The shot took William Whitmore in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the dirt. His rifle fell from nerveless fingers, landing in the dust a few feet from his body. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of flames and Cole's labored breathing. Then Harriet was there, catching Cole as he started to fall, lowering him to the ground with surprising strength. Cole, stay with me." "I'm all right," he managed, though his side felt like it was on fire and his vision was starting to blur around the edges. "Is he? He's not moving." Harriet pressed her hand to the wound in Cole's side, trying to stop the bleeding. "Don't you dare die on me, Cole Madsen. Not now, not after everything. Not planning on it," Cole said, then coughed, tasting copper. "Might need a doctor, though." The sound of hoofbeats interrupted them, and Cole tried to sit up, thinking reinforcements had arrived for William. But the riders who emerged from the pre-dawn darkness wore the Territorial Marshal's badge, and Dr. Wright was with them, his medical bag bouncing against his saddle. "Ellen Matthews sent a telegram to the Marshal last night," Dr. Wright said, dismounting and rushing to Cole's side. "Told him everything about her husband's confession and her suspicions about William Whitmore. We've been riding through the night to get here." He examined Cole's wounds with quick, efficient movements. "The shoulder's not serious, but this side wound needs immediate attention. Help me get him into the cabin." The Marshal, a grizzled man named Carson, walked over to where William Whitmore lay in the dirt. He knelt, checked for a pulse, then shook his head. "He's gone. Madsen, you're going to need to give a statement once the doctor's patched you up." "Self-defense," Cole said through gritted teeth as Dr. Wright and one of the deputies hauled him toward Harriet's cabin. "He confessed to 3 murders and tried to kill us both." Harriet heard everything. "I did," Harriet confirmed, her voice shaking but firm. "Every word. He killed Thomas for the inheritance, Daniel to protect his finances, Jonathan to hide his fraud. He said it all." Marshal Carson nodded slowly. "We'll take statements from both of you. Doc, how long before Madsen can talk?" "Give me an hour to get this bleeding stopped and the wounds cleaned," Dr. Wright said, guiding Cole through the cabin door. "Then you can have your statement." The next hour was a blur of pain and antiseptic, and the doctor's steady hands working to repair the damage William's bullets had done. The shoulder wound was indeed minor, more bleeding than danger. But the side wound had cracked a rib and torn through muscle, requiring careful stitching and tight bandaging. Harriet stayed by Cole's side through all of it, holding his hand when the pain got too intense, wiping sweat from his forehead, refusing to leave, even when Dr. Wright suggested she might want to wait outside. When the doctor finally finished and declared Cole stable, Harriet leaned down and kissed him gently on the forehead. "You saved my life," she whispered. "Again. Seems like I'm making a habit of it," Cole said with a weak smile. "Try not to need saving too often. I don't think I can take many more bullets." They gave their statements to Marshal Carson as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The marshal wrote everything down in careful detail: William's confession, the attack, the self-defense shooting. When he was finished, he looked at Harriet with something like sympathy. "Ma'am, I want you to know that the territorial government will be issuing an official statement clearing your name. William Whitmore acted alone in all 3 murders, motivated by greed and self-preservation. You were never cursed, never responsible, and I'm going to make damn sure everyone in Silver Ridge knows it." Harriet's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Marshal." After Carson and his deputies left, taking William's body with them, Harriet and Cole were finally alone. The sun was fully up now, revealing the extent of the damage. Cole's cabin was nothing but charred timber and ash, still smoking in the morning light. But Harriet's cabin stood untouched, and the garden beyond was already showing signs of the vegetables they'd planted together months ago. "Guess I need to rebuild," Cole said, looking at the ruins with a rueful expression. "Guess you do," Harriet agreed. "But maybe this time we build something bigger. Something with room for 2. Cole turned to look at her, ignoring the pull of his stitches. "Harriet Brennan, are you proposing to me?" "I'm proposing that we stop pretending we can live separately," Harriet said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I'm proposing that we build a real home together, that we stop letting fear and the past dictate our future. I'm proposing that we get married, Cole Madsen, and that we spend the rest of our lives proving that love isn't a curse. It's the only thing that makes any of this worthwhile." Cole pulled her down beside him on the bed, wrapping his good arm around her shoulders. "I accept your proposal on one condition." "What's that?" "That you promise me we'll have the most boring, uneventful marriage in the history of Montana Territory. No more murders, no more mysteries, no more shootouts. Just you and me and maybe some chickens and that goat we talked about." Harriet laughed through her tears. "I think I can manage that." "Then yes," Cole said, kissing her properly this time, despite the pain in his side. "Yes to everything." The news of William Whitmore's confession and death spread through Silver Ridge like wildfire. By noon, half the town had ridden out to Harriet's property, not to gawk or judge, but to apologize. Margaret Peterson came, with tears streaming down her face, begging forgiveness for the years of cruelty. The minister arrived to formally welcome Harriet back to the church community. Even some of the men who'd bet on Cole's death came to shake his hand and admit they'd been wrong about everything. Dr. Wright stayed the longest, sitting with Harriet on her porch while Cole rested inside. "I should have spoken up years ago," the doctor said quietly. "Should have trusted my instincts about those deaths. Should have pushed for real investigations instead of accepting easy answers. I failed you, Mrs. Brennan, and I'll carry that regret for the rest of my life." "You spoke up when it mattered," Harriet said gently. "You helped Cole understand what to look for, and that led us to the truth. That's more than most people did." "Still," Dr. Wright said, "if there's ever anything you need, medical care, testimony for legal matters, anything at all, you call on me. It's the least I can do." Ellen Matthews returned to Silver Ridge 3 days later, her written confession delivered to the marshal and her conscience finally clear. She and Harriet spent a long afternoon talking, crying, and eventually forgiving both themselves and each other. Ellen's husband had been a broken man who'd planned murder, but never had the chance to execute it. and the guilt of believing she'd enabled his crimes had nearly destroyed her. Knowing the truth, that William had been the killer all along, didn't erase her pain. But it did allow her to finally begin healing. "You're free now," Ellen said as they walked through Harriet's garden. "Free of the curse, free of the blame, free to live whatever life you choose." "So are you," Harriet replied, squeezing her hand. "We're both free." Cole recovered slowly over the following weeks, his wounds healing under Dr. Wright's careful attention. He spent his convalescence planning the new house he and Harriet would build, something larger than either of their previous cabins, with a real kitchen and a bedroom and space for the family they both hoped to have someday. Harriet sat with him through the long afternoons, sketching out floor plans and arguing good-naturedly about whether they needed a root cellar or a covered porch or both. They were married in September, on a clear Sunday morning, with half of Silver Ridge in attendance. The ceremony took place on their property, with the foundation of their new house visible in the background, a symbol of the future they were building together. Harriet wore a dress of sky-blue silk, refusing to wear black or grey or anything that spoke of mourning. This was a beginning, not an ending, and she wanted her clothing to reflect that. Cole wore his best shirt and vest, one arm still in a sling, but his smile as bright as the autumn sun. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence was profound and absolute. No one believed in curses anymore. No one feared for Cole's life or whispered about death following the bride. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said, beaming. "Mr. Madsen, you may kiss your bride," and Cole did, long and thoroughly, while the crowd cheered and whistled and celebrated a love that had survived not one curse, but 3 murders and 13 years of isolation and fear. That evening, after the guests had departed and they were finally alone, Cole and Harriet sat on the steps of their future home, watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed so much pain. And finally, Joy, do you ever think about them?" Cole asked quietly. "Thomas and Daniel and Jonathan?" "Every day," Harriet admitted. "I loved them all in different ways, and I'll always carry a piece of grief for what they should have had, the lives William stole from them. But I'm learning that loving you doesn't mean forgetting them. It means honoring what they taught me about love, while building something new. They would have wanted you to be happy," Cole said with certainty. "Any man who truly loved you would want that, I know." Harriet leaned her head against his shoulder, the good one, careful of his healing wounds. "And I am happy, Cole. For the first time in 13 years, I'm truly happy. Not because the curse is broken. There never was a curse. But because I'm finally free to believe I deserve this. Deserve you. You deserve everything," Cole said, wrapping his arm around her. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, one by one, in the darkening sky. The house would be finished by winter. They'd have chickens and a goat by spring. They'd plant a garden even bigger than the one they'd already started. They'd live and love and argue and make up and build a life together that was ordinary and extraordinary all at once. The Black Widow of Silver Ridge was gone, replaced by Harriet Madsen, wife, friend, survivor, and finally, after so many years of darkness, a woman who believed in the possibility of happy endings. The wedding night found them not in some fancy hotel, but in Harriet's small cabin, the same place where she'd spent 8 years believing she was doomed to solitude. But everything felt different now. The shadows that had haunted the corners seemed to have lifted, replaced by lamplight and the warmth of Cole's presence beside her. "Tell me something," Harriet said, as they lay together, Cole's injured side carefully supported by pillows. "When you first rode into Silver Ridge and heard the stories about me, what did you really think?" Cole was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her arm. "Honestly, I thought the whole thing sounded like nonsense. I've traveled enough to know that small towns love their ghost stories, their cautionary tales. Usually there's a woman at the center who didn't fit the mold, too independent, too beautiful, too something, and the town creates a legend to explain why she should be feared rather than admired. So you never believed I was cursed? Not for a second, Cole said firmly. But I also didn't realize someone was actively murdering people. I thought you were just unlucky, that you'd lost people you loved through tragic circumstances, and the town had blown it out of proportion. When I started digging deeper, when the patterns emerged, he shook his head. That's when I got angry, really angry, because it meant someone had not only killed 3 innocent men, but they'd stolen 13 years of your life by making you believe you were the monster. Harriet was quiet, processing this. Do you think William planned it all from the beginning? Killing Thomas, then waiting to see if I'd remarry so he could kill again? I think he was opportunistic, Cole said thoughtfully. He killed Thomas for the ranch, probably thinking that would be the end of it. But then you survived your grief, found love again with Daniel, and William couldn't stand it. Here he was, struggling to run the ranch, needing loans from the very bank where your new husband worked. I think seeing you happy while he was failing drove him to rage. So he killed Daniel, partly to eliminate the financial threat, partly to punish you. And Jonathan was pure self-preservation. By that point, William was desperate. The ranch was failing. He'd committed fraud to try to save it, and Jonathan's survey threatened to expose everything. William had already been killed twice. What was one more? Cole's voice hardened. Men like William, they start down a dark path, and every step makes the next one easier. Murder becomes just another tool, another solution to their problems. He almost succeeded with you, Harriet whispered, her hand moving to rest gently on Cole's bandaged side. Almost only counts in horseshoes, Cole said with a slight smile. Besides, I had advantages your other husbands didn't. I knew someone was hunting you. I was prepared. And most importantly, I had you, someone worth fighting for, worth surviving for. The next morning brought visitors, not the apology bearers of the previous day, but people with practical concerns. The owner of the general store arrived with a proposition to sell Harriet's sewing work in his shop, displayed prominently with her name attached. The head of the ladies' auxiliary came to personally invite Harriet to not just attend meetings, but to lead them. Even the mayor stopped by, officially welcoming the Madsons to Silver Ridge and asking if Cole might consider running for town council in the next election. It's overwhelming, Harriet admitted to Cole after the mayor left. Yesterday I was a pariah. Today they're treating me like some kind of hero. Guilt is a powerful motivator, Cole observed. They're trying to make amends for 13 years of cruelty. You don't have to accept every invitation, Harriet. You don't owe them anything. I know, Harriet said slowly, but maybe being part of the community again is something I want. Not for them, but for me. I've been alone so long, Cole. I don't want to be alone anymore. You're not alone, Cole reminded her. You have me. That's not going to change. I know, but I think I need more than just you. No offense, she added quickly. I need friends, connections, a place in the world beyond these 4 walls. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Cole said, pulling her close. Just promise me you'll take it slow. You don't have to rebuild your entire social life in a week. Over the following months, as Cole's wounds healed and autumn gave way to winter, they found a rhythm. Cole returned to work at the McClintock Ranch, though the owner had offered him a partnership stake as a reward for cleaning up the Whitmore mess, as he put it. Construction on their new house progressed steadily, with neighbors volunteering. Labor and materials in what felt like penance for past sins. Harriet accepted some invitations and declined others, slowly rebuilding a social life on her own terms. She discovered that she enjoyed teaching sewing to the younger women in town, found satisfaction in contributing to church charity projects, and even developed an unexpected friendship with Margaret Peterson, the same woman who'd condemned her in the general store months earlier. I was cruel to you, Margaret admitted one afternoon as they worked together on quilts for the church. I let my fear and my prejudice dictate my actions, and I justified it with religion and superstition. I'm ashamed of the role I played in your isolation. You weren't alone in it, Harriet said quietly. The whole town participated. That doesn't excuse my behavior. I was one of the leaders, one of the voices calling you cursed. If I'd shown compassion instead of judgment, others might have followed my example. Margaret set down her needle, looking at Harriet directly. I can't undo the past, but I want you to know that I see you clearly now. I see a woman who survived more than anyone should have to survive, who kept her dignity and her humanity despite everything. You're stronger than I'll ever be. Strength isn't about avoiding pain, Harriet said. It's about continuing despite it. You're stronger than you think, Margaret. The friendship that grew from that conversation became one of the anchors of Harriet's new life. Margaret's husband owned the saloon where so many cruel bets had been placed, and Margaret made him shut down all gambling on Harriet's life and post a sign declaring that the Black Widow stories are lies. Anyone perpetuating them will be banned. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to Harriet. Winter settled over Silver Ridge with unusual gentleness that year. The snows were light, the temperatures moderate, and Cole joked that even the weather was trying to make amends for the past. Their new house took shape gradually, a solid two-story structure with glass windows that had been shipped from Helena, a stone fireplace large enough to heat the entire ground floor, and a kitchen with a cast-iron stove that was Harriet's pride and joy. They moved in just before Christmas, carrying their few possessions from Harriet's old cabin to the new house in a single afternoon. That evening, they lit the fireplace for the first time and sat on the floor, their furniture not yet delivered. From the craftsman in town, eating bread and cheese and drinking wine that Margaret had gifted them. "We should make a tradition," Harriet said suddenly. "Every Christmas, we tell each other one thing we're grateful for from the past year." "Just one thing," Cole teased. "I can think of at least a dozen." "Start with the most important one," Harriet said. Cole set down his wineglass and took her hands. "You. I'm grateful for you, for your courage, your resilience, your willingness to trust me when every experience you'd had taught you that trust was dangerous. You're the bravest person I've ever met, Harriet Madsen." Harriet felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm grateful for you too, for your stubbornness, your refusal to believe in curses, your willingness to risk everything to find the truth. You gave me my life back, Cole. Not just by solving the mystery, but by showing me that I was worth saving." They sealed the moment with a kiss, their first in their new home, and Harriet felt something settle deep in her chest. A sense of belonging, of rightness, that she'd thought was lost to her forever. Timothy, the delivery boy who'd been one. Of Harriet's few connections to the outside world during her years of isolation, came by the next day with a package. He was 18 now, preparing to leave for college in the spring, and he'd brought a parting gift, a journal bound in leather, its pages blank and waiting. "I thought you might want to write your story," Timothy said shyly. "Not the story the town tells about you, but the real story. What it was like, what you survived, what you learned. Seems like that kind of truth should be preserved." Harriet accepted the gift with trembling hands. "Thank you, Timothy. You were kind to me when no one else was. I won't forget that." "I was just doing my job, Mom." "No," Harriet said firmly. "You treated me like a person when everyone else treated me like a ghost story. That wasn't part of your job. That was a choice you made. A brave one." Timothy blushed and made his excuses, but as Harriet watched him ride away, she realized he was right about the journal. Her story deserved to be told, not as a cautionary tale or a ghost story, but as a testament to survival, to the power of truth, and to the possibility of redemption. She began writing that very evening, sitting at her new kitchen table while Cole read by the fire. The words came slowly at first, painful and halting, as she described Thomas's death and the confusion and grief that had followed. But as she wrote, something loosened in her chest, a knot of old pain beginning to unravel. Spring came early, to Montana Territory that year, bringing wildflowers and new life. The chickens Cole had promised arrived in March, 6 hens and a rooster who crowed at ungodly hours and drove Cole to distraction. The goat followed in April, a gentle creature named Clementine who produced rich milk and kept the grass around the house neatly trimmed. Harriet's belly began to swell with their first child in May, a development that filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. Dr. Wright assured them that Harriet was healthy, that the pregnancy was progressing normally, that there was no reason to worry. But Harriet couldn't help remembering all the things that had been taken from her, and couldn't help fearing that this happiness too might be stolen. "Stop borrowing trouble," Cole told her one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. His hand rested on her belly, feeling the flutter of movement beneath. "This baby is going to be fine. You're going to be fine. We're going to grow old together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, arguing about whose turn it is to milk the goat." "You promise?" Harriet asked, knowing it was a promise no one could truly make. "I promise I'll do everything in my power to make it happen," Cole said. "And my power is considerable. I survived 3 bullets and a burning building after all." Their daughter was born in November, on a crisp autumn morning, with leaves falling like gold coins outside the bedroom window. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Harriet thought she might not survive it. But Dr. Wright was there, experienced and calm, and Cole never left her side, holding her hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement when she wanted to give up. When the baby finally emerged, wailing and red-faced and absolutely perfect, Harriet wept with relief and joy, and the overwhelming realization that she'd created life instead of being surrounded by death. Cole cut the cord with shaking hands, and when Dr. Wright placed their daughter in Harriet's arms, the world seemed to crystallize into a single perfect moment of clarity. "What should we name her?" Cole asked, his voice rough with emotion. Harriet looked down at the tiny face, the eyes already trying to focus. The miniature fingers curled into fists. She thought about all the names she couldn't use, names that belonged to the past, to grief, to people who'd been taken too soon. And then she knew. "Hope," she said softly. "Her name is Hope, because that's what this child represented. Hope for the future, hope that happiness could last, hope that the darkness had finally been banished for good." The years that followed were the kind that don't make for dramatic stories, years of ordinary joys and common struggles, of children growing and crops being planted, and the slow, steady building of a life. Hope was joined by a brother they named Thomas, after Harriet's first husband, and then another daughter they named Grace. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Cole adding rooms and porches as needed. Harriet finished her journal when Hope turned 5, filling the last page with a reflection on how far she'd come from that terrified woman living alone in a cabin at the edge of town. She dedicated it to her children, hoping they'd read it someday and understand what their mother had survived, what their father had risked, and why truth and courage mattered more than superstition and fear. And in the years to come, when people told the story of the cursed widow and the cowboy who broke the curse, Cole would always correct them with a smile. There was no curse to break, he'd say, bouncing a grandchild on his knee, while Harriet rolled her eyes affectionately from her rocking chair. Just a truth that needed finding, and a love worth fighting for. And a woman brave enough to believe she deserved happiness after the world tried to convince her otherwise. Harriet would add her own coda to the story, speaking to her grandchildren with the wisdom of age and experience. "Remember that the stories people tell about you aren't always true. Sometimes the world needs a villain or a victim, and they'll cast you in that role, whether you fit it or not. But you get to write your own ending. You get to decide who you are, not them." It was a lesson hard-won and dearly bought, paid for in blood and grief and 13 years of isolation. But it was also a lesson that transformed not just Harriet's life, but the lives of everyone who heard her story and understood its deeper truth, The winter after Hope turned 3, a woman arrived in Silver Ridge under circumstances that made Harriet's heart ache with recognition. Her name was Catherine Wells, and she'd buried 2 husbands in rapid succession back in Colorado. The whispers had followed her across state lines. Another cursed woman, another black widow, another bride who brought death instead of joy. She'd come to Montana hoping to escape the reputation, but small-town gossip traveled faster than stagecoaches. Harriet heard about Catherine from Margaret, who mentioned the new arrival with concern rather than judgment, a change in Margaret's character that still sometimes surprised Harriet. Even after years of friendship, "She's staying at the boarding house," Margaret said, as they worked together on a quilt for the church bazaar. "Won't talk to anyone, barely comes out of her room. Mrs. Henderson says she pays in advance and keeps to herself. The poor woman looks absolutely haunted." Harriet set down her needle, thinking about that cabin at the edge of town, about 8 years of self-imposed exile, about the crushing weight of believing yourself cursed. "I should visit her. Do you think that's wise?" Margaret asked carefully. People might what? Think I'm consorting with another cursed woman?" Harriet smiled without humor. "Let them think about what they want. I know what it's like to be where she is, and I won't leave her there alone if I can help it." The boarding house was on the east side of Silver Ridge, a respectable establishment run by Mrs. Henderson, a widow who'd made her peace with Harriet after William's confession. Mrs. Henderson directed Harriet to Catherine's room on the 2nd floor, knocking gently before leaving the 2 women alone. Catherine Wells opened the door with obvious reluctance, and Harriet saw her own past reflected in the woman's haunted eyes. Catherine was perhaps 25, with auburn hair pulled back severely and a dress that had seen better days. She looked like she'd been crying recently, and the room behind her was Spartan, a bed, a chair, a small table with a Bible and nothing else. "Mrs. Wells, my name is Harriet Madsen. I was hoping we could talk." Catherine's expression shuttered immediately. "If you've come to tell me to leave town, I'll be gone by morning. I don't want trouble. I haven't come to tell you to leave," Harriet said gently. "I've come to tell you that I understand, that I've been where you are, and that you don't have to face it alone." Something flickered in Catherine's eyes. Confusion, then recognition. "You're the woman they call the Black Widow, the one who killed 3 husbands." "I'm the woman they used to call the Black Widow," Harriet corrected. "Before the truth came out, before everyone learned that I didn't kill anyone, that I was just unlucky, and the town needed someone to blame." She gestured to the room. "May I come in?" Catherine stepped back wordlessly, allowing Harriet to enter. They sat on the narrow bed, there being nowhere else to sit, and Harriet told her story. Not the abbreviated version she'd given others, but the full, painful truth. The deaths, the isolation, the crushing guilt, the years of believing she was poisoned at her core. And then Cole, the investigation, William's confession, the slow rebuilding of a life. Catherine listened without interrupting, tears streaming down her face. When Harriet finished, Catherine said, "My husbands both died of fever." "Summer fever," the doctor said. "Natural causes." "But they died within 6 months of each other, and people said I must have done something, poisoned them, cursed them, brought disease into their homes. My first husband's family threw me out. My second husband's family did the same. And everywhere I go, the stories follow. Have you considered that someone might be doing to you what was done to me?" Harriet asked carefully. "That someone might have a reason to want you isolated and blamed?" Catherine shook her head. "I've thought about it, but who? I have no family, no inheritance, nothing anyone would want. I'm just unlucky, cursed by God or fate or whatever force governs these things." "You're not cursed," Harriet said firmly, taking Catherine's hands. "You're grieving and traumatized and surrounded by people who'd rather believe in supernatural evil than face the complexity of real tragedy. But you're not cursed, Catherine. You're just human." The conversation lasted hours, with Harriet sharing not just her story, but the practical reality of survival, how to build a life in the face of suspicion, how to distinguish between genuine friendship and pity, how to protect yourself without shutting out the possibility of connection. When Harriet finally left, Catherine looked less haunted, as if some burden had been shared and therefore lessened. Over the following months, Harriet became Catherine's guide and friend. She introduced her to the women of Silver Ridge, who'd learned compassion through their own mistakes with Harriet. She helped Catherine find work as a schoolteacher, the children being blessedly free of their parents' superstitions. And slowly, painfully, Catherine began to emerge from the shadow of her own supposed curse. The experience changed something in Harriet. She realized that her story, painful as it had been, gave her a unique ability to help others facing similar circumstances. Women whose reputations had been destroyed by gossip and fear. People who'd been branded as different, dangerous, or cursed simply because the world needed someone to blame for inexplicable tragedy. She started writing letters to newspapers, sharing her story, not for attention, but to challenge the narratives that destroyed innocent lives. One letter published in the Helena Independent caused such a stir that Harriet received dozens of responses from women across the territory, all telling similar stories of loss and blame and isolation. "You're starting a movement," Cole observed one evening, as Harriet sorted through yet another stack of letters. Hope was playing at her feet while Thomas napped upstairs, and Grace was due any day. "I'm just telling the truth," Harriet said. "But if the truth helps people, then maybe that's what I'm supposed to do with what happened to me. Maybe surviving wasn't enough. Maybe I'm supposed to help others survive too." Cole smiled at her with such pride that Harriet felt her chest tighten. "You know what I love most about you? Your capacity for turning pain into purpose. Most people would have let the bitterness consume them. You turned it into compassion. I had a good teacher," Harriet said, reaching for his hand. "You showed me that surviving isn't the same as living, remember? Well, now I'm showing others." The letters kept coming, and Harriet answered each one personally. Some were from women who'd lost multiple husbands and faced accusations of murder. Others were from people ostracized for different reasons. Accusations of witchcraft, suspicions of mental illness, the simple crime of being different in a world that demanded conformity. Harriet responded to all of them with the same message: "You are not alone. Your pain is real, but so is your strength. The stories others tell about you do not define you." Her correspondence became so extensive that Cole built her a small office attached to their house, with a desk and shelves for her growing collection of letters. Harriet organized them by type and location, creating what amounted to a catalogue of how superstition and fear destroyed lives across the American West. She dreamed of publishing them someday, not to exploit anyone's pain, but to create a record that might prevent future injustices. When Grace was born on a snowy December morning, Harriet felt the deep satisfaction of a life not just rebuilt, but expanded beyond what she'd thought possible. 3 children, a loving husband, a purpose that extended beyond her own survival. It was more than she'd dared hope for during those dark years in the cabin. But the past never entirely releases its grip, and there were still moments when the old fears surfaced. A cough from one of the children would send Harriet into panic, certain that illness would steal them, as death had stolen so much before. Cole's occasional trips to neighboring ranches for work filled her with dread that he wouldn't return. And sometimes, late at night, she'd wake from nightmares where William Whitmore was still alive, still hunting, still destroying everything she loved. On those nights, Cole would hold her and remind her that William was dead, that the children were healthy, that she was safe. "The scars don't disappear," he'd say, "but they don't have to control you either. You get to decide how much power the past has over your present." It was good advice, though not always easy to follow. Harriet found that helping others was often the best remedy for her own fears. When she was writing letters or counseling women like Catherine, she felt strong and purposeful. It was only in the quiet moments, when memory had space to breathe, that the old terrors crept back in. The 5th anniversary of their marriage brought an unexpected visitor, Ellen Matthews, returning to Silver Ridge for the first time since she'd made her confession. She was older now, grayer, but her eyes held a peace that had been absent before. I wanted to see how you were, Ellen said as she and Harriet walked through the garden behind the house. I wanted to make sure my confession had actually helped, rather than just easing my own guilt. It helped, Harriet assured her. It was the beginning of understanding what really happened, of unraveling the truth. Without you, Cole and I might never have figured out that we were looking for a murderer instead of accepting a curse. Ellen nodded, watching Hope and Thomas play in the yard while baby Grace napped in Harriet's arms. You have a beautiful family. It's what you deserved all along, what those other men should have given you if they'd lived. They would have, Harriet said softly. Thomas and Daniel and Jonathan, they all would have wanted children, wanted this life. William stole that from them and from me. But I'm learning that honoring their memory doesn't mean drowning in grief forever. It means living fully the way they didn't get to. That's a hard-won wisdom, Ellen observed. My children are grown now, making their own lives. And I'm learning to forgive myself for the silence I kept all those years. Your example helped with that. Seeing you transform suffering into strength made me realize I could do the same. They talked through the afternoon, two women bound by tragedy, but no longer defined by it. When Ellen left the next morning, she pressed a small package into Harriet's hands, a locket containing tiny portraits of her two husbands. Painted from photographs. I thought you might want these, Ellen said. To remember them as they were, not as corpses or cautionary tales, but as men who loved you and were stolen too soon. Harriet clutched the locket, tears streaming. She'd had no images of Thomas, Daniel, or Jonathan. Their families had kept all photographs, wanting no reminders of the cursed widow who'd supposedly killed their sons. This small gift was more precious than Ellen could know. She wore the locket every day afterward, a small weight against her heart that felt like both grief and gratitude. The children asked about the portraits eventually, and Harriet told them the truth, that she'd been married before their father, that those men had died, and that she'd loved them even though she loved Cole differently. Did you love Papa more? Hope asked with the directness of childhood. Harriet considered the question carefully. I love your Papa in a way that includes everything I learned from loving and losing Thomas and Daniel and Jonathan. So it's not more or less, it's deeper, richer, because it's built on understanding how precious and fragile love can be. Does that make sense? Hope nodded solemnly. Papa says you're the bravest person he knows. Your Papa is biased, Harriet said with a smile. But I'll take the compliment anyway. As the years accumulated, 10 years since William's death, then 15, then 20, Harriet's story became less about her personal tragedy and more about the broader lessons it taught. She was invited to speak at women's gatherings across Montana Territory, sharing her experience not for sympathy, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of superstition and the importance of seeking truth. Her speeches were always well attended, though not always well received. Some people still clung to their belief in curses and supernatural explanations for tragedy. Others accused her of exploiting her dead husbands for personal gain. But enough people listened, enough people learned, that Harriet felt her work was worthwhile. The territorial legislature even invited her to testify about the need for better investigative procedures when suspicious deaths occurred. Her testimony, combined with Dr. Wright's professional expertise, led to new regulations requiring autopsies in cases of unexpected death, a small change that might prevent future murders from being dismissed as curses or bad luck. You're making history, Cole told her after she returned from the capital, exhausted but satisfied. Changing laws, changing minds. Thomas and Daniel and Jonathan would be proud of what you've accomplished in their memory. I hope so, Harriet said. I hope wherever they are, they know that their deaths weren't meaningless, that something good came from all that pain. The children grew as children do. Hope became a teacher like Catherine Wells had been, dedicated to education and fighting ignorance wherever she found it. Thomas became a lawyer, specializing in defending people falsely accused of crimes, a calling his mother's story had inspired. Grace, the youngest, became a writer, documenting the stories of women across the West who'd been victimized by superstition and fear, and Cole and Harriet grew old together. Exactly as Cole had predicted on that spring day when he'd proposed building a life together. They argued about the chickens and the goat and whose turn it was to fix the fence. They celebrated births and mourned deaths and weathered the storms that any long marriage encounters. They loved each other with the fierce dedication of two people who'd fought for the right to love at all. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the children threw them a party that filled the house to bursting. Grandchildren ran shrieking through the rooms, while friends and neighbors toasted the couple who'd proven that love could survive anything, even murder, suspicion, and 13 years of enforced isolation. Dr. Wright attended, now in his 80s and retired but still sharp as ever. "You know," he said to Harriet during a quiet moment, "I've delivered a lot of babies and treated a lot of patients over the years. But saving you, helping you uncover the truth, that might be the most important thing I ever did. Because look at all the lives you've touched, all the people you've helped. That ripple effect started with one conversation in my office. It started with Cole asking questions," Harriet corrected, "with his refusal to accept easy answers. It started with your survival," Dr. Wright countered. "Everything else followed from that single stubborn act of continuing to exist when the world wanted you to disappear." As the party wound down and the guests departed, Harriet and Cole found themselves alone on their porch, the same spot where they'd sat so many evenings over the years, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Do you ever regret it?" Harriet asked suddenly. "Taking on a cursed widow and all the complications that came with her?" Cole laughed, a sound warm as summer. "Not for a single second. You were the best decision I ever made, Harriet Madsen. And I'd do it all again. The investigation, the shootout, the bullets, if it meant ending up right here with you." "Even the bullets," Harriet teased. "Even the bullets," Cole confirmed. "Though maybe we could skip those on the second go-around." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, surrounded by the life they'd built together. A life that shouldn't have been possible according to the curse. A life that 3 men had been denied. A life that William Whitmore had tried to prevent with murder and manipulation. But here it was, anyway, messy and beautiful and absolutely real. That in a world quick to judge and slow to forgive, the bravest thing you can do is refuse to accept the narrative others write for you. The bravest thing you can do is survive and love and build something beautiful from the ruins of what was stolen. And that, in the end, was the truest thing of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.